Hello everyone, this is Bradwood, and today I'm going to be showing you a couple newish features in CFConfig. So CFConfig is a module for command box CLI. Does not come installed by default, but you can easily install it by installing command box-cfconfig. And hopefully you're already familiar with it. I'm going to assume you're familiar with it for this screencast, but essentially it's used for importing and exporting configuration from a Lucy or a Cold Fusion server. And we've added a few features recently, somewhat recently. The first one here is most of you should be familiar with the convention of a .cfconfig.json file. What you can also have now is, by convention, by just placing this file in the web root, when you start a command box server, command box or CFConfig specifically on server start will look for a file called .cfconfig-web.json. And if it finds that file, it will import those settings into the web context for a Lucy server, which would involve things like scheduled tasks. And for completeness, you can name the default file cfconfig-server, does the same thing as a .cfconfig.json file. If you use Adobe Cold Fusion, you do not have any need to have a separate web and server file because there's only one context, there's only one place to import things into. It doesn't matter. But if you're in Lucy, you want to be able to script out things like your scheduled tasks. Is very important, or your logging settings. Typically, those are pulled from the web context as well. With that, there's also some new conventions for environment variable overrides. There's, first of all, environment variables specifically for the JSON files being imported. You can have CFConfig web, CFConfig server. And also, if you're overriding individual settings with an environment variable such as cfconfig_admin pass equals your password, there's also the same thing here where you can name the environment variable cfconfig_web_ and then the name of the setting, and that'll specifically go into the web context. And then for completeness, the default is the same as cfconfig_server_ and the name of the setting. Again, if you're on Adobe Cold Fusion, all of these will be imported into the exact same place. It doesn't matter. But for Lucy, you could override, just the web context password or just the server context password using this basic convention as well. Okay, so that's for the JSON files. There's also some additional functionality when importing or exporting settings, which is pretty useful, and that is the include list and exclude list. Previously, if I have a little test over here, this is just a Coldbox application template. I just use this as a quick example because it already comes with a .env file and a .cfconfig.json. When you import or export settings, by default, you've always just gotten the full list of settings. So everything you see here is cfconfig show, which includes all your data sources, caches, mail servers, logs. Everything goes into a JSON file, and that's always been the case for importing and exporting. Everything gets imported, everything gets exported. Occasionally, you might want to say, well, I only want to export just the data sources all on their own. And you would have to export everything and then go in and just edit the JSON. But that's not a requirement any longer. So if we look at the .cfconfig.json file for our little Coldbox app, we can see it has a handful of settings, including caches and data sources. So I can say cfconfig export, and we'll look at the help real quick. You can see there's a bunch of settings here, like pause the scheduled tasks. So there's an include list, so a list of properties to include in the transfer. Use star for a wildcard. And if you use the include list, it'll only include those properties. Or an exclude list means every property but the ones that I specify. So you could show something like mail servers, data sources, .mydsn, event star, right? And that would control what we exported. So if we said export to data sources.json, and then we have an include list, and I say data sources is the only thing that I would like to export, then if we cat out our data sources.json file, we can see that we only exported the data sources configuration. And the same thing works on CFConfig import. You specify an include list or an exclude list, and you get just those items or everything but those items. So that gives you a lot of ability to just override parts of a configuration from the same JSON file. And then finally, you'll notice that if I go back and dump out this file that was originally bundled with our ColdBox app template, the data source was defined like this with these nice little environment variable placeholders, right? So we have, DB host, DB driver, DB database, and these are all coming from this .env file, which was packaged with this ColdBox sample app, right? So these placeholders are being injected into the JSON. However, this data sources.json file that I just exported, by default, it hard-coded all these values in here. So the username, the port, the database name. We don't have those environment variable placeholders, so it would be up to me to go in and manually edit this JSON file and put in those placeholders, which can kind of be a bit of a bummer. Because what might happen is you edit a setting via the Lucy or ColdFusion administrator, and you think, oh, I'd like to export my settings, the latest version of my settings, and I want to overwrite my local config file. So you do this, but then you realize you just overwrote the version of your config file that had all those nice placeholders, and now all those placeholders are missing from your JSON file. So for that, we have a really nice feature called our JSON expansion replacements. And this does two things. It will allow you to automatically swap out certain properties in the JSON file with an environment variable placeholder, and it will store the actual runtime values automatically in your .env file or a file of your choosing. But by default, it'll put it in your .env file. So the syntax can look a little hairy, but it's not too crazy bad. So here I have CFConfig export to my file, and then we have a replace parameter. And let's look at our help here. Export help. So replace is a struct, which means you can provide as many replace parameters as you want using this colon syntax. And it's a regular expression replacement match to swap out data with environment variable expansions. So the way you specify a struct in the command line is the name of the parameter replace, and then a colon, and then basically our key in the struct, and then our value. So we can have as many of these replace parameters as we like. So in this case, these backslashes are escaping my period. Since this is a regular expression, I want to have a literal period. So replace data sources.mydsn.password with db_password. That's my environment variable replacement. So if we look at this particular test server, CFconfig show data sources, we have a data source called ColdBox. So if I say, actually, I'm just going to copy this to my clipboard. I don't want to type it all again. CFconfig export to my .cfconfig.json file, and then I'm going to change this, instead of my DSN, I'm going to change it to be, ColdBox, which is the actual name. So replace data sources.coldbox.password with dbpassword environment variable. So now if we take a look at the cfconfig.json file that generated, and we look for our data source chunk, we can see the password no longer has the actual runtime value of the password, but it's been replaced automatically with the db_password environment variable or system setting expansion. And then if that didn't already exist in my .env file, it goes ahead and it creates it, and it sets it equal to whatever the runtime value was. Now, the runtime value in this case actually was an empty string, which makes this a bit of a lame example because you can't see that it actually pulled the real password out of my data source. But this allows you to automate those replacements of the system settings. So to look at a bit more complicated example, since these are regular expressions, you can have capture groups, and then you can reference those capture groups in the replacements. So let's look at this example here. CFconfig export to cfconfig.cfconfig.json. This time I'm going to say data sources dot any text as a capture group dot password. I want that to be replaced with db_capture group here, which is the name of the data source _password. Okay, so let's take a look at our cfconfig.json file, see what we got exported. This time, it dynamically came up with the name db underscore coldbox underscore password because that was the name of my data source, and that's what I told it to do. And then if we look in our .env file, we see it created an environment variable for us called db underscore coldbox underscore password equal to whatever my password is, which again is a very boring empty string. And so we can actually get pretty clever with the expansion groups here, or the capture groups rather, I should say, for our regular expression. So here's an example that says CFConfig export, putting it into my .cfconfig.json file. In this case, I want to replace data sources dot any data source dot and then password or class or port or host or database. Any of those items I want to replace with db underscore capture group 1 underscore capture group 2, which is going to be name of data source and then the key inside the data source. And then we can even specify where we want the .env file to be. I'm going to go ahead and just say put it in settings.properties in the current directory. So let's see what this creates for us. Oops. So if we look in my CFConfig.json file, we can see now we automatically did multiple replacements, each of them db underscore coldbox underscore database, coldbox underscore host, coldbox password, coldbox port. So now we have a separate environment variable for each data source. I only have one data source, so it's not quite as interesting as an example. And then if we look in that settings.properties file, here we created the environment variables automatically, and we pulled the runtime values out of that. So this just makes it way easier if your team uses those placeholders in your JSON file, and you don't want to have to worry about manually going back in and editing the JSON file or accidentally, committing your passwords or something to source control. Is CFConfig will swap those values out. And with the regular expressions, it's really powerful. You can have as many of those replacements defined as you want. So based on what your team decides to replace and what you replace it with, you can much more easily manage that. And of course, it would be kind of boring, not boring, it'd be cumbersome to always specify those replacements. So the CFConfig module allows you to set defaults as config settings inside the module that apply every time you export configuration. So modules.commandbox cfconfig.json expansions. So in these examples, we could say I want all of my mail server passwords to be replaced with mail underscore password. I want all of these items of all my data sources to be replaced with the example I just showed you. And then I want request timeout to be replaced with settings like this. So these would be something you set up once as a config setting, and then anytime you ever run a CFConfig export command, you would just automatically have this applied. So you wouldn't have to think about it every time. So there's a lot of flexibility for you and your team to kind of decide how you want to manage your JSON files, and then we want to try to remove as many of those kind of manual steps every time. So that's not even everything we've added to CFConfig, but that's the most interesting stuff. Feel free playing around with that, and happy CF configuring, everyone. I'll see you next time.